Hello, I'm Sean Lim, and welcome to After 10. Syria's civil war has been raging for over 2.5 years, and in the crosshairs are millions of children who are either displaced or are refugees. On tonight's After 10, we speak with UNICEF about the potential of a lost generation in Syria. Stay with us. The civil war in Syria is in its third year. Innocent children find themselves in the middle of a cruel and horrendous situation. The official number of children refugees from Syria totals more than 1 million, and there are also about 3,500 without parents, guardians, or homes. In August, Syrian forces launched a chemical attack on innocent civilians. The International Society continues to support the Syrian refugee children, and Korea has also stated it will do whatever it can to help. Well, thank you so much for joining us tonight on After 10 to share with us your insights on the current plight of children in Syria.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you.
Well, you're here in Korea. Is this your first time to our country, and what's your main purpose of the trip?
It is actually my first time in the country, and the reason we're here is because UNICEF has a very strong partnership with Korea, and of course we have a strong partnership with the government. So we were actually here because we had annual consultations with the government, but the partnership extends beyond government. Also, we're very much supported by the people of Korea, so we're also happy to have opportunities like this to also reach out to the Korean people and explain a little bit about what UNICEF is doing.
Right, and I think this is a great opportunity to let our viewers know what you guys are doing in Syria, and particularly in the case of protecting the welfare of the children there. You recently seem to have put more emphasis on Syria. Is that the case? Has the situation there with children gotten worse?
Yeah, absolutely. It's actually among the worst emergencies that we're now facing, both in terms of numbers, because if you actually think about it, we now have over 9 million people affected inside Syria, but we also have over 2 million people that have actually fled the country. And the majority of these affected are actually children. So we're talking about something like 5.7 million children affected by the conflict. So that's just in terms of numbers, that's massive.
And that's out of a population of 27 million
27
people?
million people, so that's like...
So 20% of the population being affected are children?
Yeah.
And how do you go about trying to get people to understand that if you wait on this, there's a point of no return?
There is a point at which catching up education becomes very difficult. For some of these children inside Syria right now, they've lost over 2 years of schooling. You can do catch-up education up to a point, but if you're a young teenager, you've been out of school for 3 or 4 years, and you're trying to go back into formal education, it becomes very difficult. If you've been repeatedly exposed to violence, repeatedly displaced, and there is no program of psychosocial support and no care and support structures in the community to take care of you and your family, you also can bear the scars for a long time to come. The reason we are focusing on this a lost generation strategy is in fact to avoid having a situation where the people who are in the future are going to have to rebuild Syria are not in a position to do so. These children who are experiencing all this violence today, all this conflict, are the adults of tomorrow who will need to rebuild the country. And we're saying, first of all, protect children from violence so that they do not have to either witness the violence or be the victims of that violence. Second, invest not only in life-saving activities, but also in education and protection activities so that these children can have a sense of being a child, can have a sense of normalcy, of being in a learning space so that they can grow up and become productive adults.
What are you doing specifically to try to create an atmosphere where this generation is not lost?
What we're trying to do right now is to provide education to kids both in Syria and those kids that have had to flee Syria, so are in the neighboring countries, either in camps or in host communities. So we do try to provide schooling and education, as well as giving them as much as possible a safe environment, so where they can actually still be children. But we also need to realize that, however much effort we are putting into this, and other organizations that we're working with are putting into this, the problem is much bigger than what we're at this point able to address. So we need to really scale up, and for others to see the importance of this issue of, not creating a lost generation.
If I can give a few numbers, we've reached about 500,000 children with learning activities over the last year. This is UNICEF and its partners working with different, entities in the region. But at the same time, we estimate that 2 million children have dropped out of school since 2012. So, really the scale up that Joka speaks about is to reach, every one of these children.
Well, Syria has been in this situation for over 2.5 years, and during the conflicts, there were, opinions saying that Assad will probably fall, but now it seems as if he is not going anywhere. And do you plan in that case, do you plan for a long-term situation, or are you hoping that it'll resolve itself quickly?
What Syria needs is a political solution to the conflict, and we are all expecting or that Geneva II can yield the talks that are supposed to take place between the government and the opposition can actually result in a political dialogue, because this is not going to be resolved militarily. There needs to be a political solution, and that's the first thing that the children of Syria and neighboring countries need is peace. At the same time, 2.5 years into the conflict, what we're seeing is a population that's exhausted, a population whose coping mechanisms have been, taken to the maximum, and they can go no more. We also have winter coming, so there's an urgency to the response now, because we have populations that are trapped behind conflict lines, and we need to get to them with winter clothing, with blankets. I know the weather's getting colder here in Korea as well, and you can imagine what it's like to be in a place without heating, without access to sufficient clothing or blankets as the temperatures are dropping. And we're also seeing a situation where the health services have been strained. So we've got concerns about disease outbreaks. There's been suspected polio cases identified in Syria, and if that's the case, that means that the whole sub-region has to restart immunization campaigns against polio, which is currently being planned because of the suspected polio cases. So really a terrible situation, and a protracted one. We really are looking at something that's going to continue into 2014 that requires the support of the people of Korea and of the people of the world and the governments of the world.
Well, you mentioned that people have this trauma fatigue, but we know children are also very resilient in a lot of situations. Yes. But where do you see them suffering the most? Like when you talk to them, where do they say that they need the most help?
It's true that children are very often very resilient. I was in Jordan in the refugee camp in Zatari, the biggest refugee camp, in July, and I was talking to a small boy who had been in the camp for 2 years. And first we talked a little bit about football, because that was his interest and it's my interest as well. And then I asked him, what he wanted to be when he grew up, when he would be grown up. And it was very interesting, because he said, I really want to be a teacher, because we kids, we need education. So when I grow up, I'm going to be a teacher, and then I can help, kids to become educated. And I found that was a very good example, of a kid in very difficult circumstances still being able to sort of look at how he, as a kid, could be able to help kids later on. But I mean, to come back to your question, I mean, there's of course a lot of risks that these kids face, and we've already been talking about them. I mean, there's the immediate sort of life-threatening situations when you have disease outbreaks, then you have, of course, what we talked about, the sort of psychosocial problems that children have. You know, some of them have been displaced 4 or 5 times. They leave behind, you know, the environment that they're used to and all that. And then, well, the whole issue of providing a future for them. So there's really many risks, and children are, of course, the most vulnerable to these risks.
In a lot of these situations, how do the parents react? Because just a fundamental, it seems, human trait, it seems, if you can't really provide for your children, it takes a toll on you. So
Right.
What have you been noticing about the parents?
I mean, the fact is that the disempowerment that comes from not being able to protect yourself and your family, from perhaps having been a very productive individual who then finds yourself at the mercy of handouts is profound. I was in Lebanon a couple of weeks ago, and I met with a father who had basically been part owner of a sweet shop. They made famous Arabic sweets that are quite tasty. And he found himself basically running out of money. And his son now, who was 16-year-old, had to go work in a local Lebanese sweet factory to make ends meet to be able to pay the bill. And they did not know how they were going to keep the kids in school that month. And the father was feeling very disempowered and feeling like you know, his life as he knew it was over. At the same time, he was determined, and he was proud of the fact that he had kept his family together. And I think in many ways, this is the untold story of the Syria crisis, that the most courageous people are Syrian families and communities. They have been the first responders. Before UNICEF came, before the UN came, before the NGOs, the first people who responded to the situation and who empowered themselves to respond are the Syrian families who took care of themselves, who still take care of themselves today and try to find ways to keep going under extremely difficult circumstances.
Right, so it's the community coming together there.
Absolutely. And if I may, not just Syrian communities. It's Syrian communities and communities from neighboring countries. The generosity of the Lebanese people, of the Jordanians, of the Turks has been exemplary, honestly. I mean, they've welcomed people into their midst that perhaps you and I would have a hard time doing, you know, kind of letting someone stay in the third spare room that we have and welcoming them and letting them stay there is a remarkable amount of generosity.
Why are they being so well received in the neighboring countries? Is it something that everybody in that region kind of understands and really has empathy for?
You know, they've been receiving these refugees in a way that, I mean, we can only admire. Again, you know, with this conflict, you know, being now in its 3rd year, you can of course also see that the refugees that come to host communities who themselves are also poor and vulnerable. So you can also see that coping mechanisms are being eroded, that the services, of course the refugees also put a heavy burden on the services. So it's becoming more difficult for them. So I think that's why it's important that we also look at not just the refugees, but also see what support you know, the communities that receive them actually need in order to be able to sustain the hospitality that they've been giving them, and at the same time trying to improve their own living conditions as well.
So it seems like it's a great time for organizations like UNICEF to come in and help support these communities with resources and infrastructure. And like you said before, you're not the only people doing this. So how do you coordinate this massive campaign together?
I mean, there are a large number of organizations, and UNICEF cooperates with a number of organizations. We work very closely with the World Food Program, UNHCR, with World Health Organization, with non-governmental organizations. A very famous one is the Syrian Arab Red Crescent, which has done a remarkable job, especially getting supplies across lines of conflict inside Syria. And then we work with a large number of non-governmental organizations. We have what are called sector coordination group or clusters that bring us together, and usually there's different organizations that are the lead, and they work with the local authorities. And in the case of UNICEF, we're the lead in supporting coordination for water, for education, and for nutrition. So, we try to avoid duplication. We try to avoid leaving gaps behind. It's not perfect, but it works somehow, despite the large number of actors.
So what is the hardest part of this campaign?
I would say that the hardest part is what I just mentioned, the insecurity. So the difficulty that we're actually facing, our staff is actually facing day to day in trying to deliver their programs. The second is indeed the fact that we don't have access to a lot of people because they live in areas where we are unable to reach them because they're under siege. And I think the third is that this is, as you may imagine, it's an expensive operation, and I think we're very grateful to all the governments and organizations and people that have supported us so far. But if the conflict doesn't end, you can already see that there will be more needs in 2014. So to actually sustain that is a challenge.
And I've read from some reports it takes hundreds of millions of dollars a year to provide the services, and that's just a portion of what people need. Do you think the overemphasis on the chemical weapons issue has helped or hurt your cause? Has it enhanced people's attention on the issue, or has it obscured it a bit?
Anything that can reduce the risk of war on the civilian population is welcome. But it's clear that many children and many people have died in Syria way beyond what has happened with the chemical weapons. And what's important is that the momentum of dialogue that has started because of the chemical weapon now extends to the peace process as a whole. And that the access that has been granted to the chemical weapons inspectors also be used to provide access for humanitarian actors. There was recently a presidential statement by the Security Council calling for greater access, and again, all parties need to cooperate on that access that is essential. It is also essential that there be security for the humanitarian workers on the ground, as Yoka has said. I mean, imagine every day our colleagues inside Syria are operating in a war zone. And every day they're basically risking their lives in order to get services to the children of Syria, humanitarian services to the children of Syria. It's remarkable what they're doing. It's remarkable what our colleagues are doing in neighboring countries as well. Our support is needed for them.
And so under these traumatic conditions, you mentioned that there's a psychosocial breakdown. And I hear that you guys are trying to offer services for psychotherapy. How does that look in a situation like this?
Well, I mean, it could take various forms. But for instance, what we're working with organizations who would then work with these children, and sort of by sometimes drawing and playing and acting, you can sort of see what the psychosocial trauma is, and then you can try to overcome it. And some, of course, cases are much more complicated, and they will then have to be referred to, really more specialist care. So that's what we're trying to do, basically to give children that space, that environment, and then work with specialists to know how to recognize trauma and how to deal with that. But I mean, of course, it's much more important to try to prevent it from happening. So that's when we try to offer the kids, the safe spaces. The schools are important for that, but of course, the most important thing is for the conflict to stop.
Right. How are you working at the headquarters to try to drum up more international support?
we're working together with other agencies also on this campaign to sort of prevent a lost generation from occurring. We are trying, we're using every opportunity in media, in contacts with people that matter to get the issue across, and of course, we try to show through our programs that we can actually do something about it.
And is there anything that you would like to get across to our viewers about the issue or why they should care? There's a lot of suffering all around the world in different demographic groups, but why is this issue so particularly important right now?
What I started out saying, it's the sheer numbers. As we just said, we're talking about 5.7 million children. I mean, that's a real serious issue. And I think everybody would agree that, children's rights need to be respected wherever they are. I think the rights of these children have been not respected for a very long time. And so we should all feel for that. But the second point, as we tried to point out, is that it's also their right to a future. And the children's right to a future, but also, the ability that we will have by investing in these kids.
You can deal with their future, the future of Syria and the region, but also perhaps have a generation of Syrian children who learns to live with the other, who relearns to live with the other, because Syrian society lived with each other before. Before this conflict, this was a plural society that worked and lived with each other. And you want to regain that. This is something that you don't ever want to lose in any society. And we have that chance of not losing that.
Well, it's certainly great that you guys have your minds on the future and are really doing things to help resolve the present. Yoka, Ed, thank you so much for joining us tonight on After 10.
Thank you for having us.
After 10 made its debut on November 2nd, 2012, and this Friday marks its one-year anniversary. You can always drop us a line to tell us how you like the show or what you'd like to see. Thanks for joining us this time, and we'll see you again. Goodbye.